The year is 1884. The Dakota, a towering structure rising on Central Park West, is hailed as the pinnacle of luxury. And yet, the elite of New York turn their noses up at it. A symbol of opulence, but too far removed from the heart of the city. At least, that's what they believed, until one by one, the city's wealthiest families abandoned their sprawling mansions for the promise of hotel-level service, towering views, and maintenance-free living. They sacrificed the familiar grandeur of their estates for something new, something revolutionary, and in doing so, they changed the face of American wealth forever. But what was the true cost of this innovation? And did it, in the end, destroy the very aristocracy it was meant to serve? The dream that demanded everything. In the late 1870s, Central Park West was little more than a remote stretch of land, and the idea of building a luxury apartment here seemed outlandish. The city ended at 59th Street. Beyond that, the Upper West Side was a wilderness of shanties and rocky outcrops. Squatters lived in makeshift homes. Goats wandered freely. The new park, Frederick Law Olmsted's masterpiece, sat like an emerald jewel dropped in mud. But Edward Clark saw something else. Clark was a man who built fortunes from thread. His Singer sewing machine company had made him one of the richest men in America. $40 million rich. The kind of wealth that demanded monuments. And Clark wanted to build the impossible, a French chateau transplanted to the frontier of Manhattan, a palace for people who had never lived in apartments. The very word apartment carried shame in 1878. It meant poverty. It meant boarding houses where strangers shared walls and bathrooms. It meant the kind of life respectable families avoided. The wealthy lived in private homes. They owned entire buildings on Fifth Avenue, with ballrooms that could hold 200 guests and dining rooms paneled in mahogany shipped from Honduras. But Clark understood something the old families did not. He understood that even the richest New Yorkers were drowning in the cost of grandeur. A Fifth Avenue mansion required a staff of 12 to 15 people. Butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, cooks, scullery maids, chambermaids, laundresses. Each person required a salary, a room, food, uniforms. Each person represented thousands of dollars every year. The mansions themselves demanded constant repair. Roofs leaked, chimneys cracked, furnaces consumed coal by the ton. Clark proposed a revolution disguised as a building. He would create apartments so luxurious that no one could call them shameful, so spacious that they rivaled townhouses, so well appointed that the word apartment would have to be redefined, and he would provide all the services of a grand estate: doormen, elevator operators, maintenance staff, even a restaurant, but shared among dozens of families. The economics were irresistible. Why pay for 12 servants when you could pay a fraction of that cost and receive better service? He hired Henry Janeway Hardenberg, an architect barely out of his 20s, who had never designed anything remotely this ambitious. Together, they sketched a building that defied every convention. It would rise 8 stories, plus a 9th floor for servants and storage. It would contain 65 apartments, each one enormous. The smallest units offered 4 rooms. The largest sprawled across 20 rooms and took up entire floors. The exterior would be German Renaissance meets French chateau, gables and dormers, bay windows and balconies, terracotta panels depicting cherubs and flowers, an interior courtyard to provide light and air. Passenger elevators, still a novelty in 1878, powered by steam. The name itself was a joke, the Dakota. People said the Upper West Side was so remote it might as well be the Dakota Territory. Clark embraced the mockery. He commissioned a key sculpture of a Native American head to crown the building's entrance. If they wanted to call it the frontier, he would make it the most civilized frontier in the world. Construction began in 1880. The building rose slowly from the rocky soil, stone by stone, brick by brick. The structure demanded everything from its creators, and soon the costs would spiral into territory no one had anticipated. When the numbers stopped making sense, at first, it was the architect's dream. But soon, the cost of building a palace in the sky began to haunt its creators. Edward Clark had budgeted $300,000 for the Dakota, a staggering sum in 1880, enough to build 30 ordinary houses. But this was no ordinary project, and the building had other plans. The foundation alone consumed months and money. The Upper West Side sat on bedrock, but between the surface and that solid stone lay 40 feet of glacial debris, clay, and boulders. Workers dug down through the earth, removing thousands of tons of material. They hit water. The excavation became a pond. Pumps ran day and night. When they finally reached bedrock, they discovered it was uneven. The engineers designed a stepped foundation to distribute the building's weight. They poured concrete, reinforced with iron. The foundation cost $70,000, nearly a quarter of the original budget, and they had not yet risen above ground. The building demanded materials no one had used before. The walls were not simple brick. They were compound constructions, an outer layer of pressed brick from Philadelphia, an air gap for insulation, an inner layer of common brick, then plaster. The walls at the base measured 28 inches thick, enough to support the weight of 8 stories and still provide insulation against New York's bitter winters. The roof required copper, not shingles, not slate, but sheets of copper that would patina into that distinctive green. Copper cost 5 times more than other materials, but Clark insisted. The building would outlast him. It would outlast everyone. It needed a roof that would last a century. The elevators were mechanical marvels and financial disasters. 4 hydraulic elevators, each one custom designed. The hydraulic system required a 70,000-gallon water tank on the roof and pumps in the basement. When the first elevator was tested, it failed. The manufacturer had to redesign the entire mechanism. Months of delay. Thousands of dollars evaporated. Then came the amenities that separated the Dakota from mere housing. A private restaurant in the basement, a laundry with the latest machinery, a playroom for children, a gymnasium, servants' quarters on the top floor with dormer windows and skylights, storage rooms with individual locks for each apartment, a coal room that could hold enough fuel to heat the entire building through winter, boiler rooms, machine rooms, spaces for things no one had anticipated. The interior. Details cost more than most buildings. Hardenberg insisted on oak parquet floors in geometric patterns, mahogany mantels, marble in the lobbies, bronze fixtures, stained glass. Every apartment received finished plaster moldings on the ceilings, picture rails, wainscoting. The building demanded craftsmen, and craftsmen demanded wages. Stonemasons carved the terracotta panels by hand. Plasterers spent weeks on single rooms. Carpenters fitted doors with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. Ironworkers installed decorative railings on every balcony. By 1882, Clark had spent $600,000, twice his budget. The building was not finished. He kept building. He was 73 years old and dying. Cancer was consuming him, but he would not stop. He hired more workers. He ordered more materials. The Dakota would be completed. It would be perfect. It would prove that luxury could be democratized without being diminished. The final cost approached $800,000. Some accounts claimed it exceeded $1 million. No one knew exactly. Clark died in 1882 before the building opened. He never saw a single resident move in. He poured his fortune into stone and brick and left behind a structure that would either vindicate his vision or stand as a monument to hubris. The Dakota opened in October 1884, empty, waiting, hungry for residents who were not yet ready to abandon their mansions. The first residents and the rise of New York's elite. As the first residents moved in, they discovered that this apartment was unlike anything they had ever imagined, a gilded cage with hotel-level amenities. The first family to sign a lease was the Langham family. Theodore Langham, a banker with old money and new ambitions. He took a 10-room apartment on the 4th floor. Rent, $1,800 per year. More than most Americans earned in a decade. Less than maintaining a Fifth Avenue mansion for a single year. Langham walked through the empty apartment in September 1884. The rooms stretched before him in a railroad configuration, one leading into the next. The parlor faced the park, 14-foot ceilings, windows 9 feet tall, oak floors polished to a mirror shine, a fireplace with a marble mantel imported from Italy, gas lighting with fixtures of crystal and bronze. He moved through the dining room, the library, 3 bedrooms, a morning room, a serving pantry. Each space larger than necessary, each detail more refined than expected. The bedrooms had closets, a luxury in 1884 when most people stored clothes in wardrobes. The bathrooms had porcelain fixtures and hot running water supplied from the building's own boiler system. But it was the services that transformed the Dakota from housing into something unprecedented. A doorman stood at the entrance 24 hours a day. He knew every resident by name. He accepted packages and deliveries. He turned away unwanted visitors. He was the first line of defense between the wealthy families and the city beyond. The elevators meant no one climbed stairs. Visitors arrived at your door without being winded. Elderly residents could live on upper floors without difficulty. Deliveries came directly to the apartment. The building maintained its own staff. If a faucet leaked, you did not hire a plumber. You notified the superintendent. The building fixed it. If you wanted your apartment cleaned while you summered in Newport, the building arranged it. If you needed additional servants for a dinner party, the building could recommend them. The restaurant in the basement offered meals for residents who did not want to cook. White tablecloths, a menu that changed daily. The cost added to your monthly bill. Some families ate there 5 nights a week. Why maintain a cook and a kitchen staff when the building employed professionals? The Langhams were followed by the Maynards. Then the Clarks, Edward's own family, taking the largest apartments. The Steinways, the piano manufacturers, took space on the upper floors. Within 6 months, 25 apartments were occupied. These early residents discovered something unexpected. They were not isolated in their own homes. They were part of a community. They met in the elevator. They nodded to each other in the lobby. Their children played together in the courtyard. The building created forced proximity among families who had previously lived behind walls and gates. This proximity had consequences no one anticipated. The wealthy had always lived near each other. Fifth Avenue was lined with their mansions, but they maintained strict boundaries. Tall fences, private entrances, carriages that arrived and departed through back alleys. Now they shared hallways. They heard each other through walls, however thick. They knew when neighbors traveled, when they entertained, when they fought. Some families thrived in this new arrangement. Dinner parties became easier to organize when your guests lived 3 floors up. Women could visit without formal calling cards. Children had playmates without crossing traffic-filled streets. Other families chafed at the intimacy. Mrs. Steinway complained that she could hear the Clarks' piano through the floor. The Langhams were appalled when the apartment above theirs was rented to a family in retail. New money with all the gauche behavior that implied. But even those who complained did not leave. Because the alternative meant returning to the exhausting burden of maintaining a mansion. And increasingly, that burden felt like a punishment for wealth rather than a privilege. The building had them. It provided too much to abandon. It made life too easy to refuse. The Dakota was patient. It could wait for the mansions to crumble under their own weight. The secrets within the walls. What was it really like to live in the Dakota? Behind the lavish interiors and sweeping views, secrets began to fester. The building's walls held more than bricks and mortar. They held the accumulated weight of lives lived in too close proximity, of systems strained beyond their design, of compromises that no one discussed in public. The hydraulic elevators broke down constantly. The technology was new, experimental. A seal would rupture, pressure would drop. Passengers found themselves trapped between floors for an hour, sometimes longer, while the maintenance crew bled air from the system and repaired the leak. Claustrophobia mixed with indignation. One resident, a Mrs. Vanderpool, refused to use the elevators after being trapped for 90 minutes. She was 72 years old and lived on the 7th floor. She climbed the stairs every day until her death in 1891. The steam heating system, a marvel when it worked, created its own torments. Radiators hissed and clanked through the night. Some apartments roasted, while others froze. The superintendent adjusted valves, constantly chasing an equilibrium that never came. Residents opened windows in January. They wore coats indoors in November. The building could not find a middle ground. The shared walls transmitted more than heat. Sound traveled through the structure in unpredictable ways. A piano on the 4th floor vibrated through the ironwork and emerged in the basement restaurant. Conversations held in normal tones could be heard in adjacent apartments if you pressed your ear to the wall. The building's architects had prioritized grandeur over acoustics. Everyone paid the price. Water pressure varied by floor and time of day. The roof tank supplied all 65 apartments through a single system. When the Clarks drew a bath on the 8th floor, the Langhams on the 4th found their faucets reduced to a trickle. Morning hours, when everyone prepared for the day, became a competition for water. The building's plumbing could not handle the simultaneous demands of wealthy families who had always had unlimited resources. Then there were the personal secrets, the kind that accumulate when people live in close quarters with thin walls and shared staff. The doormen and elevator operators saw everything. They knew who came and went at unusual hours. They knew which residents fought, which drank, which entertained men who were not their husbands or women who were not their wives. The staff kept quiet. Their jobs depended on discretion, but knowledge is power, and they held considerable knowledge. In 1887, a scandal erupted when a maid discovered that one of the 4th floor residents, a respected banker named Holloway, was maintaining a second family in the building, His mistress lived 2 floors above his wife. He visited her on evenings when he claimed to be at his club. The mistress became pregnant. The wife found out. Holloway left the Dakota in disgrace, but the building remained, indifferent to the ruin it had witnessed. The restaurant in the basement became a source of tension. Some families used it exclusively and dismissed their cooks. Others viewed it as an admission of failure. Proper households prepared their own meals. The restaurant created a visible hierarchy among residents. Those who ate there frequently were perceived as less committed to maintaining household standards. Those who never ate there were perceived as snobbish. The children posed unexpected problems. The courtyard was designed to provide light and ventilation, not as a playground. But children played there anyway. They shouted. They threw balls that broke windows. Parents complained about other people's children while insisting their own offspring were perfectly behaved. The building management installed rules. No playing before 9 in the morning, no playing after 5 in the evening. The rules were ignored. Storage became a battleground. Each apartment received a locked storage room in the basement. The rooms were identical in size, 8 feet by 10 feet. But some families accumulated more than others. They expanded into the hallways. They claimed unused spaces. The superintendent posted notices. The violations continued. Wealth did not guarantee reasonableness. The Dakota demanded cooperation among people who had never cooperated before. They had lived as isolated units, each family its own kingdom. Now they were subjects of a building that required consensus, compromise, shared sacrifice. Some adapted. Others simmered with resentment at every petty indignity. And beneath all of it, beneath the mechanical failures and the personal dramas, lay a deeper problem. The building could not live up to its own promise. It had sold itself as luxury without compromise, as grand living without sacrifice. But every shared wall was a compromise. Every broken elevator was a sacrifice. Every neighbor's party that kept you awake was a reminder that you had traded sovereignty for convenience. The residents did not leave, not yet, but the building had begun to reveal its true nature. It was not a palace, it was an experiment, and experiments sometimes fail. The cost of exclusivity. The Dakota was exclusive, but with exclusivity came a price, one that its wealthiest tenants were beginning to regret. The building's reputation attracted New York's elite, but attraction created its own problems. By 1888, the Dakota had a waiting list. Families competed for apartments. The building could be selective, and selective it became. The board of directors, composed of the largest shareholders and longest-term residents, established standards. Not written policies, nothing so crude, but understood criteria. Applicants needed references from current residents. They needed to demonstrate sufficient wealth, not merely rich, but reliably rich, with income from established sources. New money need not apply. Religion mattered. The Dakota was Protestant. Jewish families were discouraged. Catholic families faced scrutiny. The building reflected the prejudices of its time without apology. Profession mattered. Bankers and lawyers were acceptable. Doctors were marginal. Anyone in trade, no matter how wealthy, faced rejection. The building maintained standards that belonged to an older era when wealth came from inheritance rather than enterprise. This exclusivity created a peculiar isolation. The Dakota became an island within an island, the Upper West Side's own aristocratic enclave. Residents knew they were special. They were chosen. They lived in the most desirable building in a neighborhood that was still finding its identity. But Special becomes lonely when taken to extremes. The children felt it first. They attended the same schools, played in the same courtyard, celebrated birthdays together. But they had few friends outside the building. Other children's parents considered the Dakota residents snobbish. Invitations were not extended. The Dakota children formed a closed circle, a miniature society that mirrored their parents' world. The adults experienced a different kind of isolation. They had abandoned Fifth Avenue's mansion culture, but had not fully committed to the Upper West Side's emerging community. They were too wealthy for the middle-class families spreading north from 59th Street, too removed from the old aristocracy they had left behind. They occupied a strange middle ground, neither fully embraced by the old guard, nor willing to embrace the new. Social events became incestuous. The same families attended each other's dinners. The same conversations repeated. The same grievances simmered. Mrs. Langham disliked Mrs. Chang, Mrs. Steinway. Mr. Clark quarreled with Mr. Maynard over a business deal. Personal conflicts could not be escaped. You saw your enemies in the elevator. You heard them in the hallway. The building forced proximity without requiring friendship. Some residents tried to maintain connections with their former social circles on Fifth Avenue. They hosted elaborate dinners, inviting their old friends to journey uptown. The friends came once, perhaps twice, then stopped. The distance was too great. The novelty wore off. The Dakota residents realized they had been categorized as eccentric, interesting for a moment, but ultimately irrelevant to the city's true center of power. The building's location compounded the isolation. Central Park West, in 1890, remained remote. The elevated railway ran on 9th Avenue, blocks away. Carriages had to navigate rough streets. Evening events meant traveling through darkness, past undeveloped lots and questionable neighborhoods. Some families kept their old Fifth Avenue residences as winter houses, using the Dakota only for summers when the park was pleasant. This defeated the entire purpose. The exclusivity that made the Dakota desirable also made it a trap. Residents had paid enormous sums for the privilege of living there. They could not admit dissatisfaction without admitting mistake. They could not leave without losing status. So they stayed and pretended that everything was perfect. The building management reinforced the exclusivity with ever more elaborate requirements. Prospective residents faced interviews with the board. Their finances were scrutinized. Their servants were inspected. The process humiliated people who were accustomed to deference. But accepting humiliation was the price of entry, and people paid it. The irony was exquisite. The Dakota had been designed to democratize luxury, to make grand living accessible through shared costs. Instead, it had created a new aristocracy, more rigid than the old. The mansion culture had been flexible. Anyone with money could buy land and build. The Dakota was fixed. Only those the building approved could enter, and the building was hungry. It needed residents to pay the enormous operating costs. It needed occupancy to justify the expense of maintaining staff and systems, but it also needed to maintain its reputation. The contradiction created tension that no amount of crystal chandeliers could illuminate. By 1890, some residents had lived in the Dakota for 6 years. They had adapted to apartment living. They had learned to tolerate neighbors. But they had also begun to notice something unsettling. The building had not changed them. They had changed themselves to suit the building. They had accepted compromises they never would have made in their own homes. They had surrendered autonomy for convenience. And once you have made that trade, returning to autonomy becomes almost impossible. The Dakota understood this. It held them gently, firmly, permanently. They were too invested to leave. too proud to admit failure, too comfortable to embrace discomfort. The price of exclusivity, it turned out, was freedom itself, the model that killed the mansion. By 1900, families had realized something startling. Why maintain sprawling estates when a mere apartment could offer more for less? The mathematics were irrefutable. A Fifth Avenue mansion cost $30,000 per year to maintain. Taxes, servants, coal, repairs, insurance. The number varied by property size, but $30,000 was conservative for a family of standing. A Dakota apartment cost $3,000 per year. Rent, building fees, the occasional expense of additional servants for special events. Some families spent more, others less, but $3,000 covered comfortable living for most residents. $27,000 in annual savings, enough to fund European travel, enough to invest in railroads or real estate, enough to expand a business or endow a university building. Money that had previously vanished into the bottomless hunger of mansion maintenance was suddenly available for other purposes. The wealthy noticed, they calculated, they visited the Dakota, they took apartments, and one by one, the mansions began to fall. The process was gradual at first. Family would keep their mansion, but spend summers at the Dakota, enjoying the park views and relief from heat. Then they would spend winters there too, finding the building's modern heating superior to coal fireplaces and drafty halls. Eventually, they would sell the mansion. The math made sense. The lifestyle was better. Why resist? The Caroline Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue and 34th Street had been the pinnacle of New York society. Mrs. Astor had hosted the city's most exclusive balls in her third-floor ballroom. 400 guests. The number became synonymous with New York's elite. If you were not invited to Mrs. Astor's ball, you did not matter. Mrs. Astor died in 1908. The mansion was demolished in 1926. The site became a commercial building. Mrs. Astor's ballroom, where the city's aristocracy had waltzed, became retail space. Her drawing room became offices. The mansion that had defined an era vanished as though it had never existed. The Vanderbilt mansions fell like dominoes through the 1920s and 30s. Cornelius Vanderbilt's house, William Kissam Vanderbilt's chateau, the Triple Palace, 3 connected mansions that took up an entire block, all demolished, all replaced with commercial buildings or apartment towers that could house 100 families instead of 1. The economic logic was brutal. A mansion on Fifth Avenue sat on land worth millions of dollars, taxed at the full property value, generating no income. It was a monument to wealth, but monuments are expensive luxuries when the income tax arrives in 1913 and marginal rates climb above 70% by the 1940s. Families faced a choice: pay enormous taxes on money-losing property or sell to developers who would build income-generating structures. They sold. The developers built. The mansions disappeared. But the Dakota endured. It generated income. Its apartments were always occupied. It adapted to changing times, without losing its essential character. The building had discovered the formula for survival: be useful, not merely beautiful. Other luxury apartment buildings followed the Dakota's model. The Ansonia opened in 1904 on Broadway and 73rd Street, larger than the Dakota, even more elaborate. Turrets and balconies and a rooftop farm with chickens and a live bear as a mascot. The Ansonia proved the Dakota was not an anomaly, but the beginning of a trend. The Beaches opened in 1908, the Apthorpe in 1908, the Belclair, the Doralton, the San Remo, the Beresford. By 1930, the Upper West Side was lined with luxury apartment buildings, each one competing to offer the most services, the most space, the most prestige. The apartment building became the default residence for New York's wealthy. Not a compromise, not a last resort, the preferred choice. Living in a private mansion became eccentric, a waste of money and time. Apartment living was modern, efficient, sophisticated. The cultural shift happened within a single generation. In 1880, apartments were shameful. By 1930, mansions were impractical. The Dakota had not merely succeeded, it had obliterated the world it came from. The people who had resisted the Dakota, who had mocked it as too remote, too strange, too much of a compromise, watched their own homes become untenable. The property taxes alone consumed fortunes. The staff shortage after World War I made maintaining large households nearly impossible. The income tax made conspicuous consumption financially suicidal. They moved to apartments. Many moved to the Dakota itself, to the building they had once dismissed. The waiting list stretched into years. The irony was lost on no one. The frontier had become the center. The experiment had become the standard. But something was lost in the transformation. The mansions had been individualistic expressions of taste and power, each one unique, each one reflecting the personality and priorities of its owner. The Astors built differently than the Vanderbilts. The Carnegies built differently than the Fricks. Apartment buildings, even luxury ones, imposed uniformity. The Dakota offered variations, different layouts, different sizes, but all within a constrained system. You could decorate your apartment however you wished, but you could not change the building itself. You were a tenant, not a sovereign. The aristocracy had traded autonomy for convenience, and in doing so, they had ceased to be aristocratic. They had become customers. Well-served customers, certainly, privileged customers, but customers nonetheless, subject to the rules and whims of the building's management. The Dakota had killed the mansion culture by offering something better, and in killing it, the building had also killed the very idea of aristocracy as permanent, unassailable, different in kind rather than degree. The families who lived in the Dakota were wealthy, but they were not sovereign. They had been domesticated by their own desire for comfort. The shifting sands of wealth. As luxury apartments began to dominate, the old money families of New York found themselves at a crossroads: hold on to the past or embrace the future. The question was generational. The founders of fortunes, the men who had built railroads and banks and shipping empires, clung to their mansions. These were monuments to achievement, physical proof that they had conquered America's industrial age. To abandon a mansion was to admit that the achievement meant less than it once had. But their children saw things differently. Theodore Langham's son, William, grew up in the Dakota. He learned to use elevators before he learned to ride horses. He played in the courtyard with other wealthy children, developing friendships based on proximity rather than careful social engineering. He attended Columbia University and studied architecture, fascinated by the building he lived in. William Langham did not want a mansion. He found them absurd, wasteful. He understood the economics his father had explained repeatedly over dinner. A mansion cost 10 times more than an apartment and provided less comfort. Why would anyone choose that? The older generation heard this attitude as betrayal. They had built empires to create dynasties. Dynasties required estates. Estates required land and buildings that would stand for centuries. An apartment was temporary. You rented it. Someone else owned it. You could be asked to leave. But the younger generation understood something their parents did not. Permanence was an illusion. The mansions their grandparents had built were being demolished. The land was worth more than the buildings. Nothing was permanent except change. This philosophical divide created family tensions that played out in drawing rooms and lawyers' offices across New York. Wills were contested. Trusts were structured to prevent heirs from selling property. Parents tried to bind their children to a world that was already disappearing. The Dakota became a symbol of this generational war. It represented modernity, efficiency, the future. The mansions represented tradition, waste, the past. Families fought over which symbol mattered more. Some families split the difference. They kept their mansions but took apartments in the Dakota for convenience. They maintained two residences, neither one fully committed to either lifestyle. This satisfied no one but allowed them to avoid definitive choices. The Great War changed everything. Between 1914 and 1918, America's relationship with Europe and with itself transformed fundamentally. The young men who went to fight in France returned with different values. They had lived in trenches. They had seen friends die. They had no patience for the elaborate social rituals that had defined New York society. They wanted smaller lives, more authentic experiences. They moved to Greenwich Village and wrote poetry. They became artists and musicians. They rejected their parents' values explicitly and enthusiastically. The Dakota lost a generation of potential residents. The children of the original families moved out when they came of age. They found the building stuffy, old-fashioned, a relic of a pre-war world they wanted no part of. The building that had been revolutionary in 1884 felt conservative by 1920. The parents who remained aged into their 60s and 70s. They held on to their apartments with increasing stubbornness. The Dakota was their last fortress, the final place where the old world's rules still applied. They refused to accept Jewish residents. They refused to accept anyone in entertainment. Actors, musicians, people who had made money in undignified ways. But their children were dying. The war had taken many. The Spanish flu had taken more. The families were contracting, the great fortunes were being divided among fewer heirs. Some families sold their Dakota apartments and moved to smaller spaces. Others held on but stopped entertaining, stopped maintaining the social calendar that had once defined them. By 1930, the Dakota faced an existential question: adapt or die. The building management loosened restrictions. Jewish families were quietly accepted. People in retail and manufacturing could apply. The standards remained high, but the specific prejudices softened. Survival required pragmatism. The Depression accelerated the transformation. Between 1929 and 1935, many of New York's oldest families lost everything. Stock market crashes, bank failures, businesses collapsed, fortunes vanished overnight. The Dakota's rent suddenly seemed expensive. Families who had paid $3,000 per year without thought now struggled to make payments. Some left, others renegotiated. The building management faced a choice: lower rents or face vacancies. They lowered rents. The building that had once been too expensive for anyone but the super wealthy became merely expensive. Upper middle class families moved in. Doctors, lawyers, professors, people with stable incomes but not dynastic fortunes. The old guard residents were appalled. Mrs. Steinway, still alive at 92, complained that the building had become common. She did not live to see how common it would become. By 1940, the Dakota's transformation was complete. It was no longer an enclave for old money aristocrats. It was a building for successful professionals who appreciated good architecture and convenient living. The residents were educated, cultured, sophisticated, but they were not aristocrats. They worked for their money. They would work until they died. The old families who remained found themselves surrounded by a new kind of neighbor. These people did not understand the old social codes. They introduced themselves in the elevator without waiting for formal introductions. They wore casual clothes in the lobby. They treated the doormen as equals rather than servants. To the old guard, this was the end of civilization. To everyone else, it was just normal life. The Dakota had survived by abandoning the very people it was built to serve. The aristocracy had not abandoned the building. The building had abandoned the aristocracy. It chose survival over purity, adaptation over tradition. And the old money families, the ones who had made the building possible, discovered they were no longer welcome in the world they had created. The decline of the mansion era. In the early 20th century, the mansions that once defined New York's elite were falling one by one, victims of progress. The demolition happened in waves. The first wave came before World War I, as families realized the Dakota's economic model made sense. They sold their Fifth Avenue properties to developers who built commercial buildings, office space, retail, structures that generated income. The second wave came in the 1920s, during the boom years before the Depression. Real estate values soared. A mansion on Fifth Avenue sat on a plot worth $2 million or more. The building itself was worthless, often a liability, since it would need to be demolished before anything new could be built on the site. Families sold, developers bought, the wrecking crews arrived. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace came down in 1927. 3 connected mansions at Fifth Avenue and 51st Street. Richard Morris Hunt had designed them in the 1870s, French chateau style, marble and bronze and stained glass. A private art gallery, ballrooms, conservatories. The demolition took 6 months. Workers stripped the interiors first, salvaging what they could. Marble mantels, bronze fixtures, parquet floors, stained glass windows. These were sold at auction. Museums bought pieces. The rest went to dealers who resold them to the newly wealthy in other cities. Then came the structural demolition. Steel beams were cut. Walls collapsed. Dust rose in clouds that settled over the neighborhood for weeks. Passers-by stopped to watch, photographing the destruction as though it were a public execution. In a sense, it was. Each demolished mansion represented the death of a particular vision of American wealth. The vision that said rich people lived in private palaces, surrounded by servants and art and beauty. The vision that equated space with status and isolation with privilege. The site of the Triple Palace became a commercial building that contained shops, offices, and apartments. Hundreds of people worked or lived where a single family had resided. The economic efficiency was undeniable, but something irreplaceable had been lost. The pattern repeated across Manhattan. The Astor Mansion, the Huntington Mansion, the Whitney Mansion, the Payne Mansion, each one unique, each one designed by leading architects, each one demolished without hesitation when the land value exceeded the building value. By 1940, Fifth Avenue between 34th Street and 59th Street contained almost no mansions. The avenue that had been Millionaire's Row was now a commercial corridor. The wealthy had moved uptown to buildings like the Dakota, or they had left Manhattan entirely for suburban estates in Westchester or Connecticut. The few remaining mansions became museums or institutional buildings, the Frick Collection, the Cooper Hewitt. They survived because someone donated them for public use. Private ownership had become untenable. The property tax was the primary killer. New York City taxed property based on assessed value. A Fifth Avenue mansion sat on enormously valuable land. Even if the family used the mansion as their primary residence, generating no income, they still paid taxes based on what the property could generate if optimally used. A family owning a mansion on land worth $3 million might pay $60,000 per year in property taxes alone, plus maintenance, plus staff, plus utilities, plus insurance. The annual cost could reach $100,000. An apartment in the Dakota cost a fraction of that, even a massive apartment with 20 rooms. The tax burden was distributed among all residents. The maintenance cost was shared. The efficiency was ruthless. Families who tried to maintain mansions through the Depression often failed. They defaulted on taxes. The city seized the properties. The buildings were auctioned. Developers bought them for pennies on the dollar and demolished them immediately. The income tax, introduced in 1913, accelerated the decline. High earners faced marginal rates that reached 77% by 1918. Maintaining a mansion required enormous income, but the government took most of that income. The math stopped working. Some families converted their mansions into apartments, trying to generate income from the property. This rarely succeeded. Mansions were not designed for multiple families. The layouts were wrong. The plumbing was inadequate. Converting them required gutting the interiors, destroying the very features that made them valuable. The Dakota, designed from the beginning for multiple families, had no such problems. Its system scaled. Its layouts worked. It adapted to changing times without losing functionality. By 1950, the mansion era was over. The last few examples survived as curiosities, places tourists photographed, symbols of a vanished age. But they were not viable residences for wealthy families. The economic and social forces that had made them possible no longer existed. The shift from mansions to apartments was not merely architectural, it was philosophical. Mansions represented individual sovereignty. Each family ruled their own domain, answerable to no one. Apartments required cooperation, shared governance, compromise. The mansion era ended because Americans, even wealthy Americans, decided that sovereignty was not worth the cost. They would rather share expenses and accept rules than bear the full burden of independence. The Dakota had taught them this lesson. Not intentionally, not through propaganda or persuasion, simply by existing, by demonstrating that luxury could be collective without being diminished, that convenience could compensate for lost autonomy. Once learned, the lesson could not be unlearned. The mansions fell, the apartments rose. The city transformed around the simple arithmetic of shared costs and shared burdens. And the Dakota stood at the center of it all, the patient teacher that had shown New York's elite how to abandon their thrones without admitting they had surrendered. The last holdouts. Even as the Dakota flourished, some residents could not shake the feeling that they were part of something doomed to fail. Mrs. Caroline Hawthorne was 93 years old in 1948. She had lived in the Dakota since 1886, 62 years in the same apartment, the same 14 rooms on the 6th floor, the same view of the park. She had watched the world change through those windows. The park had been empty wilderness when she arrived. Now it was manicured, civilized, crowded with people who would never have been allowed near her in the old days. The Upper West Side had been dark at night. Now it blazed with electric lights. Cars had replaced horses. Skyscrapers had replaced mansions. Mrs. Hawthorne did not approve of any of it. She maintained her apartment exactly as it had been in 1886. Gaslighting, though the building had converted to electricity in 1895. Victorian furniture in the parlor. Heavy drapes that blocked the sun. She lived in a museum of her own making, preserving a world that had ended decades ago. The other residents found her eccentric. The building management found her difficult. She refused to allow workers into her apartment. When repairs were necessary, she supervised personally, making sure nothing was changed. She dressed in black, mourning a husband who had died in 1901. She took the elevator only when absolutely necessary, claiming the new hydraulic system was unsafe. She was not wrong about the building's failures. The elevator system had been replaced 3 times, the heating system twice. The plumbing constantly needed repair. The building was 70 years old in 1948. It showed its age in small ways: cracked tiles, warped floors, walls that needed replastering. But Mrs. Hawthorne saw deeper problems. She saw that the building had betrayed its original promise. It was supposed to preserve the grandeur of mansion living while eliminating the burden. Instead, it had eliminated the grandeur too. The new residents were not aristocrats. They were professionals. They worked. They had jobs. They wore business suits and carried briefcases. The building had become common. It had democratized itself to survive. And in doing so, it had made itself irrelevant to the people it was built to serve. Mrs. Hawthorne was not alone in her resistance. A core group of original families remained, concentrated on the upper floors. They maintained old social standards among themselves. They dressed formally for dinner. They employed servants, though servants were increasingly hard to find. They pretended the building was still what it had been in 1890. But they were ghosts haunting a building that had moved on without them. The younger residents did not know their names, did not care about their lineage, did not observe the social protocols that had once mattered so much. In 1948, the building management proposed converting some apartments into smaller units. The post-war housing shortage was severe. Families were desperate for places to live. The Dakota had large apartments that could be divided. The economics made sense. The old guard revolted. This was the final insult. Bad enough that the building accepted middle-class professionals. Worse that it allowed Jews and Catholics. But to divide the apartments themselves? To destroy the spaciousness that had been the building's defining feature? They fought. They organized. They threatened legal action. They claimed the conversion would violate the building's charter, damage its architectural integrity, destroy its value. They lost. The building management proceeded with selective conversions. A 20-room apartment became 2 10-room units. A 15-room apartment became 3 smaller apartments. The building's population increased. The waiting list decreased. Mrs. Hawthorne refused to speak to the new residents. She cut people in the elevator. She complained to the management constantly. She was a relic of a lost world, angry that the world had not waited for her. She died in 1952. Her family sold the apartment within a month. The new owners gutted it immediately. Out went the gas fixtures, the Victorian furniture, the heavy drapes. In came modern lighting, sleek Danish furniture, large windows with unobstructed views. The apartment was transformed in 6 weeks. The Dakota did not mourn her. Buildings do not mourn. they adapt, they survive, they serve whoever can pay. But something was lost with her death. She had been a living link to the building's origins. She remembered Edward Clark. She had attended the opening ceremonies in 1884. She had known the Dakota when it was young and strange and revolutionary. The other old families followed her example, dying one by one through the 1950s. Their apartments were sold, renovated, modernized. The building shed its past like a snake sheds skin. What remained was the physical structure, beautiful and functional, but the culture that had animated it was gone. By 1960, none of the original families remained. Dakota had outlived its creators and their children and their children's children. It had become what it was always going to become, a luxury apartment building. Not a social experiment, not a revolution, just a building. The last holdouts had believed the Dakota was special, that it represented something permanent and important. They were right about one thing. It was permanent, but they were wrong about everything else. The building did not care about their values or their traditions. It cared about survival, and survival meant adapting to whoever could pay the rent. The building won. The people lost. This is always how it goes. The changing face of Manhattan today. The Dakota stands as one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses, but its legacy is far more complicated than it appears. Walk past the building on Central Park West. The facade looks much as it did in 1884. The same German Renaissance details, the same terracotta panels, the same copper roof, now green with patina, the same entrance archway with the Native American head above it. But everything else has changed. The neighborhood is unrecognizable. Central Park West is no longer remote. It is one of the most expensive streets in America. Apartments in the Dakota sell for $10 million, $20 million, $30 million. Apartments that cost $1,800 per year to rent in 1884 now sell for sums that would have seemed like national budgets to the original residents. The building has become a monument to its own success. Tour groups stop outside and photograph it. Guides recite its history. The first luxury apartment building, the place that changed how wealthy people lived, the building where John Lennon died. Lennon's murder in 1980 made the Dakota famous in a new way. It was no longer just an architectural landmark. It was a crime scene. The spot where he was shot, just inside the archway, became a pilgrimage site. Fans leave flowers. The building tolerates this with the patience of something that has seen everything. The current residents are wealthy, but they are not the old money aristocrats the building was designed for. They are celebrities, tech entrepreneurs, hedge fund managers, people who made fortunes in industries that did not exist when the Dakota was built. They live differently than the original residents. They renovate constantly. Kitchens are gutted and rebuilt with commercial-grade appliances. Bathrooms become spas. The building's interior has been transformed apartment by apartment into something its architects would not recognize. The services have changed too. No restaurant in the basement. No live-in staff except in the largest units. The doormen remain, but their role has evolved. They manage deliveries from Amazon and Fresh Direct. They sign for dry cleaning and accept packages for residents who are never home. The building is managed professionally now, with a board of directors elected by residents and a management company that handles operations. The decisions are made by committee, governed by bylaws, documented in minutes. The informality of the early years is gone. What remains constant is the building itself. The bones are the same. The walls that have stood since 1884 still stand. The courtyard still provides light and air. The elevator shafts, though the machinery has been replaced countless times, follow the original paths. The Dakota has survived because it was built to last. Edward Clark spent $800,000 to create something permanent. He succeeded. The building outlived him by a century and will likely outlive everyone currently living in it. But the Dakota also survived because it was willing to betray its original purpose. It was built to preserve aristocratic living. It ended up democratizing luxury, teaching wealthy people to accept shared spaces and shared costs. It was built to be exclusive. It became merely expensive. The transformation was gradual enough that no single moment marked the change. But change it did. The building that was meant to preserve the past instead ushered in the future. Stand in the courtyard today, and you can feel the weight of history. The stones remember. The walls have absorbed a century and a half of lives. But the building does not care about memory. It cares about function. And it functions beautifully, serving its current residents with the same efficiency it served the Langhams and Steinways. The Dakota's legacy is complex because it achieved something its creators never intended. It did not preserve the aristocracy, it helped destroy it. By demonstrating that luxury could be collective, it undermined the very concept of aristocratic sovereignty. The old families maintained their status through isolation. They lived in separate mansions, each one a kingdom. The Dakota taught them to share. And once they learned to share, they were no longer aristocrats. They were just rich people living in a nice building. This is the building's true triumph and its greatest betrayal. It gave wealthy people everything they wanted while taking away the one thing that made them special, their separateness. The Dakota stands as proof that you can preserve a building's physical form while completely destroying its social meaning. The stones remain. The purpose died. What replaced it was something more democratic, more practical, more modern. Whether that trade was worth making depends on what you value: efficiency or grandeur, practicality or tradition, the collective or the individual. The building does not answer these questions. It just stands there, beautiful and implacable, waiting for the next century of residents to move in and make it their own. The destruction of the American mansion, the once mighty mansion, a symbol of old-world grandeur, is now a relic of a bygone era, thanks to the very innovation that was meant to preserve it. The American mansion culture died between 1880 and 1950. The Dakota did not kill it alone. But the Dakota demonstrated the logic that made mansions obsolete. And once that logic was understood, it could not be ignored. The mansions were built on a foundation of assumptions that proved false. They assumed wealth would always concentrate in families rather than individuals. They assumed servants would always be available and affordable. They assumed property taxes would remain low. They assumed social status required physical space. Every assumption collapsed. Wealth became more fluid after 1913, when the income tax redistributed fortunes. The great concentrations of capital that had built mansions were taxed away within 2 generations. Families could no longer maintain estates on inherited wealth alone. They needed to work. And working people, even very wealthy ones, cannot maintain 50-room mansions. The servant class disappeared. World War I took men from domestic service and put them in factories. They discovered they could earn more making munitions than serving meals. They did not return. World War II repeated the pattern. By 1950, the live-in servant was nearly extinct in America. Mansions required live-in staff. Without staff, they were uninhabitable. Property taxes rose steadily through the 20th century. Cities needed revenue. Real estate was easy to tax. You could not hide a mansion. You could not move it to a tax haven. It sat there, a perfect target for assessment. As taxes rose, the economics of mansion ownership became impossible. But the deepest change was cultural. Americans stopped believing that status required isolation. The Dakota taught them that sharing space did not mean losing status. In fact, the right kind of sharing could enhance status. Living at a prestigious address meant more than living in a private palace. This was a revolutionary idea. For thousands of years, wealth had been displayed through separation. Kings lived in castles, lords lived in manors, the rich lived behind walls. Physical distance from the poor was the point. The Dakota argued that distance was obsolete. You could live among other wealthy people in a shared building and maintain your status. The key was selectivity. As long as the building excluded the wrong people, living there confirmed you were the right people. This logic extended beyond the Dakota. It justified country clubs, gated communities, private schools, exclusive neighborhoods. The modern wealthy do not isolate themselves in individual fortresses. They cluster in collectively defended spaces. The mansion represented an older model, aristocratic, feudal, European, each family its own power center. The apartment building represented a newer model, corporate, democratic, American, collective strength through shared resources. America chose the apartment model, not consciously, not through debate or legislation, through millions of individual decisions by families who calculated that maintaining a mansion was not worth the cost. The mansions that survive today are museums. Vanderbilt's Biltmore in North Carolina, Hearst Castle in California, Newport's summer cottages. They survive because they stopped being homes and became tourist attractions. They generate revenue through admission tickets. They justify their existence through public service. The few private mansions that remain are owned by the super wealthy, tech billionaires, hedge fund managers, foreign oligarchs, people with fortunes so large that the cost of a mansion is trivial. But even they often prefer apartments in exclusive buildings. Bill Gates owns a mansion in Washington state, but he also owns apartments in luxury buildings in New York and elsewhere. The mansion is no longer the default residence of wealth. It is one option among many, and often not the preferred option. The Dakota demonstrated why. A well-designed apartment building offers everything a mansion offers: space, service, security, status. And it offers things mansions cannot provide: convenience, efficiency, community, location. You cannot move a mansion to the center of Manhattan. You can live in an apartment there. You cannot split maintenance costs with neighbors in a mansion. You can in an apartment. You cannot have professional building management in a mansion. You can in an apartment. The mathematics were always in the apartment's favor. The Dakota just made them visible, and once visible, they could not be ignored. The destruction of the American mansion was not violent. No one stormed Fifth Avenue with pitchforks. The mansions were demolished by accountants armed with calculators. They ran the numbers. The numbers said apartments. The mansions fell. What was lost? Beauty, individuality. The sense that a home could be a unique expression of personal taste rather than a unit in someone else's vision. The mansions were art. The apartment buildings, even the beautiful ones like the Dakota, are architecture. There is a difference. But what was gained? Efficiency, sustainability, access. More people can live well in a city of apartments than in a city of mansions. The resources go further. The space is used more intelligently. The trade was made. The mansions died. The apartments rose. and the Dakota stands as the monument to the revolution it began. The building that taught America's wealthy to abandon their castles and learn to share. Legacy and the price of luxury. As the Dakota stands tall against the backdrop of Central Park, one truth remains clear. Luxury, once reserved for the few, is now a reality for the many. But what kind of luxury? The Dakota was built to offer luxury without sacrifice. Edward Clark promised his residents they could live grandly without the burden of maintaining a private estate. They would have space, service, beauty, convenience, everything the old mansion culture offered, but better, more efficient, more modern. He was right about the efficiency. The Dakota proved that shared costs made sense. Cooperative living reduced expenses while maintaining quality. The model worked. He was wrong about the sacrifice. There was a sacrifice. The residents gave up sovereignty. They gave up the ability to live exactly as they chose, answerable to no one. They accepted rules. They tolerated neighbors. They adapted to systems designed for collective benefit rather than individual preference. This trade defined the 20th century. Americans learned to accept shared spaces, shared governance, shared responsibility. Condominiums and cooperatives became the standard form of urban housing. Even single-family homes existed within planned communities with homeowners associations and bylaws. The Dakota was the first domino. Once it fell, the others followed inevitably. The logic was too strong to resist. But something was lost in the process. The mansions, for all their wastefulness, represented a kind of freedom. The freedom to be eccentric, to build exactly what you wanted, to live without compromise, to rule your own domain. That freedom is expensive, so expensive that almost no one can afford it anymore, and even those who can often choose not to exercise it. Because freedom is lonely, because sovereignty is isolating, because living among peers in a well-managed building is easier and more pleasant than living alone in a private palace. The Dakota taught Americans that luxury is not about isolation. It is about access to quality, the best services, the best location, the best building. These can be shared without being diminished. In fact, sharing often enhances them. A building with 100 residents can afford better staff than a mansion with one family. This lesson extended beyond housing. It shaped how Americans think about luxury in every domain. Luxury cars became about access to brand and features rather than custom coachwork. Luxury travel became about premium airline seats rather than private yachts. Luxury education became about access to elite institutions rather than private tutors. Luxury democratized. It became something you purchased rather than something you owned. And in purchasing it, you accepted the terms someone else set. The Dakota represents this transformation perfectly. It was built as a monument to exclusive living. It became a monument to purchased access. The residents do not own the building, even in the cooperative structure established in the 1960s. They own shares that give them the right to live there. The building remains sovereign. They are tenants. Is this progress? That depends on your values. If you value efficiency, sustainability, and access, the Dakota represents unambiguous progress. It demonstrated how to house wealthy people densely without reducing their quality of life. It paved the way for cities that could accommodate millions while maintaining livability. If you value individuality, sovereignty, and freedom from collective governance, the Dakota represents a loss. It taught Americans to accept constraints they never would have tolerated before. It made conformity to building standards seem reasonable. Both perspectives are valid. The Dakota contains multitudes. What is certain is that the building achieved immortality. It will stand for another century, possibly longer. It was built with that intention. Edward Clark spent the money to create something permanent. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. The Dakota outlived the culture that created it. It outlived the mansion era. It outlived the Gilded Age. It outlived the old money aristocracy. It adapts to each new generation of residents, absorbing their money and their values and their dreams, then outlasting them too. This is the true price of luxury in the Dakota model. You can live there for decades. You can own shares worth millions. You can renovate your apartment to perfection. But you are temporary. The building is permanent. You serve the building more than it serves you. The residents who move in today inherit a structure with 140 years of history. They cannot change its fundamental nature. They can only adapt themselves to it. The building has rules accumulated over generations of governance. The building has systems refined over a century of operation. The building has a reputation that matters more than any individual resident. This is what the old aristocrats feared. They knew that once they accepted shared living, they would lose control. They would become subjects of the building rather than masters of their own estates. They resisted. They lost. The building won. And now it stands, beautiful and implacable, offering luxury to those who can afford it while demanding submission to its logic. The trade is explicit: money for access, autonomy for convenience, sovereignty for community. Most people make the trade gladly. They do not miss the sovereignty they never had. They enjoy the convenience. They appreciate the community. They love the building. But occasionally, someone looks at the Dakota and sees it clearly. They see the monument to a revolution that destroyed the world it came from. They see the beautiful prison that offers everything except freedom. They see the price luxury demands when it is shared rather than owned. And they wonder, was it worth it? The building does not answer. It just stands there, collecting rent, outlasting everyone who asks the question. The Dakota knows something humans struggle to accept. Permanence requires compromise. Survival requires adaptation. Buildings endure. People pass. The legacy of the Dakota is the legacy of modernity itself. We gained efficiency, access, and collective strength. We lost sovereignty, individuality, and the freedom to live entirely on our own terms. The trade was made. The mansions fell. The apartments rose. And the Dakota stands at the center of it all. The patient teacher that showed us how to abandon our thrones without admitting we had surrendered.